Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. Harris Ranch Resort, providing Western hospitality and award-winning cuisine. The Wonderful Company, committed to growing a better world. Comcast, connecting people to the moments and experiences that matter most. Producers Dairy, nourishing one life at a time. The Spencer Family. And Fresno State Associated Students Incorporated, students serving students. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Cook Land Company, E&J Gallo Winery, the Fresno Association of Realtors, and California Manufacturing and Engineering Company. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zante.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. I'm Blake Zante, Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, and your host. Today we're examining the dynamics between the White House and Congress as President-elect Donald Trump prepares to begin his second term, with Republicans controlling both chambers of Congress. Join me in analyzing this critical moment is Robert Costa, political reporter, chief election and campaign correspondent for CBS News, and co-author of the book Peril. Robert is a trusted voice in Washington politics and has closely followed the shifting dynamics in both parties. Robert, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Great, an honor to be here.
Well, let's go ahead and dive right in. We've seen how Republicans have unified control of the government at the current moment. They're, going to have the White House with President Trump coming into office and both houses of Congress. But we've not necessarily seen that meeting unification within the party. So how is that going to play out, do you think, in the next year or 2 years moving forward?
President-elect Trump clearly has a lot of ambition about what he wants to accomplish in terms of using the executive branch on policy and in terms of what he wants to pass on Capitol Hill. But he is facing some challenges. If you look at the House of Representatives, it's a narrow majority for Republicans, and Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana will have to corral Republicans again and again on some of the signature items next year, whether it's tax reform or immigration policy or trade policy. And so it's going to be difficult in the House to make sure that that narrow majority holds together, especially in a Republican Party in the House that has so many different factions. And while Republicans also have the majority in the Senate, there are senators such as Senator Susan Collins of Maine, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who are very independent-minded.
What changes do you see there in terms of, that transition taking place? Do you think that, these nominees will have a smooth confirmation, or do you think that there will be some division amongst Republicans in the Senate?
There is a fascinating dynamic at play in the Senate, Blake. You have, just like in the House, when former Speaker Pelosi decided to leave the speakership, she didn't leave the House of Representatives. She has remained this presence in the House over House Democrats, a real force, even though she's not in the leadership anymore. Senator McConnell has vacated his leadership position in the Senate, but he hasn't vacated the Senate. And so he does remain a presence, and he's much more of a traditional conservative Republican than some of the Trump allies in Congress. Now, McConnell and Trump align on things like overhauling the federal judiciary, nominating judges who are conservative. But McConnell is in no way a yes vote on everything for Trump. And you could see him start to play the role of a bit of a foil for the Trump agenda, for the Trump administration at different turns. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's an enemy of Trump or he's a political burden for Trump, because they do share a lot of political values. But McConnell, now that he's free of the leadership, will be able to make his own decisions when it comes to the nominations and legislation. And he will be someone in the ear of John Thune, the incoming majority leader. Thune has his own political capital, his own profile, but he listens to McConnell. They have built a rapport.
What do you think in terms of the value shift or values alignment that you've talked about? You're talking about how, despite, the different personalities taking place between Trump and maybe some more traditional Republicans like McConnell, they still sort of align on values. But do you see, those personality differences getting in the way of Trump trying to get through his legislative agenda in Congress?
This is a different moment, Blake, than what we saw in 2017. I covered President-elect Trump when he was President Trump in his first term in 2017 through 2021. And you saw, especially in 2017, 2018, a very messy scene politically. Trump was a total outsider coming into Congress and Capitol Hill trying to overhaul and reform health care legislation and policy, to go on after the tax code. And he had to deal with a traditional Republican Party that in many ways at that time was averse to what Trump was advocating. Now, nearly a decade later, after Trump took that escalator down in 2015 and announced his presidential run, the Republican Party arguably has been transformed. So many Republicans I've spoken to in recent weeks believe this is fully Trump's party right now. And while there is some lingering aspects of the old Republican Party, being about shrinking the government and being more traditional when it comes to policy positions and how they're articulated, especially on issues like trade, where Republicans have long been free trade, and now Trump's very much a protectionist when it comes to trade, talking about instituting tariffs across the board. You're seeing the Republican Party accepting now that Trump has the full support of the voters in the Republican Party and millions of voters across the country. And so my reporting shows that there's likely going to be less consternation, fewer tensions between the White House and Congress this time around for Trump. That doesn't mean, though, that he's not going to push them to maybe take some tough votes on some tough nominations and other issues.
Thank you. We're going to take a quick break. Up next, we'll talk more about the Democratic Party and some of the lessons learned with the Democrats in this election. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. I'm joined by Robert Costa from CBS News, political correspondent. We've just discussed the internal challenges facing the Republican Party under unified control. Now let's turn to the Democratic Party, which is grappling with its own questions about leadership and strategy after significant losses in the 2024 elections. So, Robert, let's talk a little bit about, the losses. What are some of the lessons learned from the Democratic Party this year?
Well, one of the lessons learned is that there's a real problem in the view of many Democrats in terms of reaching out to working voters in places like the Central Valley of California, in the Midwest, in the South. Senator Bernie Sanders, who I've covered for a long time, issued a statement after the election, and he said the Democrats have to do a better job of connecting with working Americans. Maybe they're working on a farm, maybe they're part of a labor union, but the Democratic Party, he argued, needs to do a more effective job at connecting people, because there is a belief among Sanders and his allies and others in the party who are more centrist that Trump, even if you don't like him, is able to speak to the grievances many people feel in this country about their economic situation, economic pain they might feel in their own lives, uncertainty about the future. And if the Democrats, Sanders and others have argued, don't do a better job of really extending a hand to those who feel that hurt, then they're going to continue to lose in these presidential elections. The challenge for the Democrats now is who is going to be the leader of the party in this new moment. And it's really, at this point, an open question. Two Californians are at the top of the list as two people who could become major figures in the coming years, already major figures in their own rights, but in terms of major figures in deciding the future of the Democratic Party. Vice President Kamala Harris, does she run again? Or does she decide perhaps to run for governor of California in 2026? This is not something that is unusual in history. Richard Nixon lost the 1960 presidential election, came back to California in 1962 and ran against Jerry Brown's father, Pat Brown. Pat Brown, of course, beat Nixon in 1962, but Nixon came back and won in 68 and 72 for the presidency. Another Californian I'm watching in terms of the future of the Democratic Party is Governor Gavin Newsom. He rose through the ranks of city government in San Francisco, became mayor, as we all know, ultimately is now governor of California. I've interviewed him at length in recent years, and ahead of the last election. And what strikes me, Blake, about Newsom is he studies the Republican Party. He studies right-wing media. He's trying to understand the cadence, the language, the personalities that are emerging on the right side of this country so that Democrats like himself can learn how to make inroads with those voters who are listening to those podcasts, watching those TV shows.
Where do you see, Governor Newsom going? You talked about this a little bit, but do you think he is positioning for a presidential run in 2028, or do you think he's still sort of weighing his options to see what Vice President Harris might decide to do, or some other candidates that are weighing their options?
Let me put it this way, Blake. When I last saw Governor Newsom, I was with him in New Hampshire. The California governor taking a little visit to a gas station in New Hampshire to shake hands. That means presidential politics might be on his mind. That he don't just end up in New Hampshire. It's a beautiful state. I'm sure people love taking vacation there. But if you're the California governor shaking hands in New Hampshire, it's okay to assume you might have the presidency on your mind. What's notable about Newsom is that he was definitely making himself well-positioned should Biden drop out, that he would be ready to run. But once it became very clear, almost immediately, that Harris would be the Democratic nominee, Newsom did nothing to contest her ascent. He became a supporter of her, endorsed her.
We're going to take a quick break. This is the Maddy Report. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. I'm here with Robert Costa, exploring the dynamics of the White House and Congress under Republican control. With an ambitious agenda, both internal party divisions and Democratic resistance will play critical roles in shaping the next 2 years. So, Robert, let's talk a little bit about the issues. You referenced this before we went to the break, but the issues that are influencing sort of voters' decisions and also the Republican policy agenda in this upcoming 2 years. Issues like Ukraine and foreign aid. How do those shape not only just voters, but how are they shaping the Republican policy agenda? And they often are divisive issues. I mean, there are Republicans who want to continue to support Ukraine, want to continue to support foreign allies overseas. But, there are also a lot of Republicans who don't want to pursue that route. So how does that shaping up and influencing the agenda?
While Republicans might have differing views internally in the House or Senate on Ukraine, President-elect Trump just won the election by saying that one of his core goals early in 2025, should he win the White House, would be striking a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine to end the war. And part of that deal, as Trump and others have spoken publicly about, would be maybe Ukraine giving up some land. And you've already seen the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky talk about the contours of a possible deal. Ukraine wants to protect the integrity and its sovereignty, the integrity of its land and its place in Europe. Whether it can become a member of NATO in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, never. These are things that are likely to be negotiated. But on foreign policy now, it's not so much a debate inside the Republican Party. It's a reaction to Trump. Trump is driving everything. He is the person on trade who's saying, I'm going to have these sweeping tariffs across the board. And those tariffs could have a real impact on places like the Central Valley. If China feels like it needs to retaliate against Trump on tariffs, that could affect the agricultural market in some capacity. And you're seeing, though, the Republicans accepting Trump doing this on tariffs. He ran on it, and he's going forward with it. And other nations are reacting. Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, flew down to Mar-a-Lago to have dinner with President-elect Trump because he knows he needs to have that personal relationship if Trump himself is going to be driving so much policy.
What about the Democrats? They're vowing to fight back on issues like abortion, immigration, some of these other issues that are very prominent, climate policy. Here in California, Governor Newsom has convened a special session of the legislature to sort of Trump-proof California, as he has coined it. is that political posturing, or is it, really actually the Democrats trying to push their policy agenda that they feel aligns with Americans and, the American people?
California is going to be a huge battleground with the Trump administration because you have a reliably blue state with a governor who's pretty ensconced and has a coalition in the state. And if you have a blue state like California, that's going to be much better positioned to fight the Trump administration on executive branch policy. So you could see California, when it comes to regulations, for example, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are starting this outside group called the Department of DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, but it's not really a federal department, but they're going to have recommendations of cutting different regulations. You could see California say, no, thank you. We're not going to take those recommendations. We're going to have our own state regulations counter whatever's happening on a federal level. And on immigration policy, you could see a real court fight between state attorney generals and governors to say we're not going to follow federal policy if we can get away with it.
What about, shifting gears a little bit? You were someone who covered extensively Trump's criminal trial, but it seemed that a lot of Americans were not paying attention to that. What do you think explains that, and do you think that that trial had any impact or will have any impact in his administration moving forward?
At this point, the sentencing seems to be being put off in New York. What strikes me about the criminal trial in New York, which I covered every day up in New York for 7 weeks, is the country seems to be exhausted by political investigations. That the level of interest in Trump and his challenges was very high in 2017 through 2020. But after January 6th, after Trump entered political winter, you didn't see the country as animated on Trump.
Up next, we're going to talk a little bit more about the challenges that are facing both parties in the coming years. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. We've explored challenges facing both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party moving forward with their strategy and the broader dynamics of policymaking under unified GOP control. Now let's look ahead to the implications for 2026 and beyond. We've talked, at length about this, Robert, but I do want to sort of, narrow it down. What do you see as the top 3 challenges for the Republicans moving forward in the next 2 years, and the top 3 challenges for the Democrats moving forward in the next 2 years?
For Republicans, it's going to be, number one, how much can they get done in 2 years? If Trump's really going to be ambitious and push things to the brink on policy, then he might see a bit of a blowback moment in 2026. A lot of presidents face a tough midterm election. So can he really get a lot done? What are his priorities in terms of immigration, tax reform, and deregulation? The number 2 issue for the Republicans is going to be who's going to be the leader for the Republican Party after Trump. He can only serve 4 years. So is it going to be Vice President-elect J.D. Vance? Is there going to be a fight that already starts pretty quickly about who's going to be the nominee in 2028? Or does Trump's personality enable that fight to kind of be put on the back burner for a few years? That's something to watch. And number 3, the biggest challenge I'm watching on Capitol Hill is, can the House Republican Conference hold together? You've followed House Republican politics very closely in your career. It's not a unified party. You have so many different blocs and groups, and Johnson, the speaker, could find himself challenged a lot. For Democrats, the challenge is, how are they going to handle Trump on immigration? If Trump does move forward with mass deportations, what's the Democratic response? How do they handle it in the states and on Capitol Hill? Is there any way they can broker a compromise or a deal with Trump on the border and on immigration? 2, on trade. Democrats have long been a protectionist-leaning party. Can they reclaim the labor unions and members of the working groups across the country And can they make an overture to them in 2025, 2026 that's effective? And number three, for the Democrats, who is going to lead the party? The Democratic National Committee already has a few different contenders to be the next chair of the DNC. Who's selected for that position is going to say a lot. Can they help reform the party, not just on the mechanics of elections, but on the coalition that the party represents?
Are there opportunities for bipartisanship moving forward in the next 2 years, 4 years, looking ahead? I mean, we talked about this polarization. We talked about the challenges facing both parties, but with a narrow House majority, there could be opportunities for folks to cross over and vote one way or another. I mean, how do you see that playing a role?
Some Trump nominees might find some bipartisan support. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is someone who supports abortion rights, has long been an environmentalist, and was at one point last year running for the Democratic presidential nomination. Now he's the nominee for Trump for Health and Human Services, and his position on food and arguing that schools need to have more organic food, more local food, this is something that could affect the Central Valley in terms of how food policy is discussed. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has won some public support from a few top Democrats who believe he's an effective person to shake up food policy and health policy in the country. Now, he will have his critics across the board as well. He has at times opposed mandates for vaccines, and that's a main part of his political project, which has caused a lot of controversy. But his position on food and health could draw some Democrats to support him. So Trump's such a singular political figure. He's not just going to likely have total Democratic opposition. Democrats will be alarmed at times about his conduct and decisions, no doubt about it. But at other times, because Trump's not in lockstep with the GOP on everything, he could actually win over some Democratic support.
I want to move to a little bit more of a personal question about you, your career. You have been a journalist for a long time now in your career. I mean, what are some of the lessons learned through these tumultuous political times that you've covered over, Trump over the last decade? What have you seen? What have you learned? And how has journalism changed over the last several years?
I think when you step back, you really start to appreciate how you can't have any assumption about what the future will bring. 24 years ago, when I was a young guy watching politics, 24 years ago, Barack Obama was a state senator in Illinois who couldn't even get a ticket to the 2000 Democratic National Convention. He wasn't well known enough, didn't have the connections. 4 years later, he gives the Democratic keynote in Boston, or was it Boston or New York? I forget, the 2004 Democratic Convention, and I believe it was Boston. And Obama ultimately gives the keynote, becomes president in 2008. Donald Trump, no one took him seriously for the most part in 2014, 2015. He wins the presidency in 2016. Joe Biden was seen as a nobody in the Democratic Party even after 8 years as vice president in 2019. He ends up winning the nomination in the presidency in 2020. Donald Trump was a convicted felon whose role on January 6, 2021 drew enormous scrutiny, yet he wins the Republican nomination in the presidency in 2024 at age 78. All this is to say that as a reporter and as a citizen and as an American, we don't know what the future will bring, and we need to be open that we are living through historic times where people like Kevin McCarthy from the Valley are suddenly Speaker of the House and then suddenly deposed. People like Donald Trump, total outsiders, can change an entire party that hasn't been changed in decades. People like Bernie Sanders, an older Democratic socialist from Vermont, can come this close to winning the Democratic nomination. It's this turbulence everywhere. It's hard for a lot of people to process, but I think if you accept that we live in turbulent times, it's easier to navigate through it because you're not expecting calm.
Robert Costa, thanks for joining the Maddy Report. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit maddyinstitute.com. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.